Blood dripped from the cathedral's broken windows as Sister Celestine pressed her face against the cold stone floor, waiting for death. The heretics had come in the night, their blasphemous chants echoing through the sacred halls of the convent sanctorum, while loyal servants of the Emperor screamed their last prayers. She could hear their boots getting closer, metal against marble, each step marking another second of life that the God Emperor might yet grant her. This was not how saints were supposed to be born. The world of Ophelia 7 burned around her, its great spires of faith reduced to funeral pyres for the faithful. Celestine was nobody then, just another seraphim sister in the Order of Our Martyred Lady, distinguished only by her fervent devotion and her skill with bolt pistol and power sword. She had served for 15 years without particular recognition, content to be another instrument in the Emperor's great design, another drop of pure faith in the ocean of his servants. But the Emperor had other plans for Sister Celestine, plans that would require her to die first. The heretic's boot appeared in her vision, black leather stained with the blood of her sisters. She could smell the corruption on him, the sweet stench of chaos worship that made her stomach turn even as her body prepared for the end. Above her, she heard him speaking in the daemon tongue, words that hurt her ears and made the air itself seem to writhe with unclean presence. Another faithful servant for the corpse god, the heretic said, switching to Gothic with an accent she did not recognize. How many of your sisters begged before they died, little bird? How many called out to your dead emperor as we sent them to join him in his eternal silence? Celestine closed her eyes and began to pray. Not for rescue, not for mercy, not even for a quick death. She prayed for the strength to die well, to meet her end with the dignity befitting a servant of the master of mankind. The Emperor protects, she whispered against the stone, though she knew that protection sometimes came in forms that mortal minds could not comprehend. The chainsword roared to life above her, its blessed teeth eager for heretic blood. But the weapon was in traitor hands now, turned against the faithful in service of powers that should not be named. Celestine heard the blade rev up to killing speed and prepared her soul for its final judgment. The blow never came. Instead, she felt heat. Not the burning agony of chainsaw teeth, but something else entirely, something that started in her chest and spread outward through every nerve and vessel until her entire body hummed with power that had no earthly source. The prayer book clutched in her hands began to glow with soft golden light, its pages turning themselves as if guided by invisible fingers. The heretic above her screamed. When Celestine opened her eyes, she saw him staggering backward, his face twisted in pain and terror as golden fire spread across his armor. The chainsword fell from his nerveless fingers to clatter against the cathedral floor, its machine spirit suddenly silent. Around them, the shadows that had filled the sacred space began to retreat, pushed back by a radiance that seemed to emanate from her very skin. She stood without conscious effort, her body moving with a grace and purpose that felt foreign, yet entirely natural. The wounds she had sustained during the night's fighting were gone, healed completely, leaving only perfect, unmarked flesh beneath her torn robes. But more than that, she could feel something else flowing through her, a presence vast and ancient and utterly benevolent that made every cell in her body sing with joy. The Emperor was with her, not watching from his golden throne, not offering distant blessing, but actually present in a way that transformed her from mortal woman into something infinitely more. The heretic tried to run. She let him take 3 steps before her bolt pistol found his head, the blessed ammunition punching through his skull with satisfying finality. But even as his body hit the ground, she could sense others throughout the cathedral, other traitors who had dared to profane this sacred space with their presence. None of them would leave alive. What followed was not battle in any conventional sense. Celestine moved through the cathedral like a living flame, her weapons striking with precision that transcended mere human skill. Every shot found its mark, Every sword stroke severed exactly what needed severing. The heretics fired back with weapons both conventional and blasphemous, but their rounds passed through empty air where she had been standing moments before, while her return fire never missed. She was no longer simply fighting. She was serving as the instrument of divine will, her body and mind perfectly attuned to the Emperor's purpose. Through her eyes, she could see the sins of her enemies written in letters of fire across their souls. Through her hands, she could deliver his judgment with absolute precision. But it was more than superhuman combat ability that marked her transformation. As she fought, she began to glow with internal light that grew stronger with each heretic she dispatched. Her hair, previously a simple brown, became threads of spun gold that moved in winds no mortal could feel. Her eyes blazed with inner fire that made it painful for enemies to look directly at her face. Most remarkably of all, she began to levitate, not through any technological means or psychic manipulation, but through pure faith made manifest. Her feet left the ground as if gravity itself was merely another law that the Emperor could choose to suspend in service of his will. The surviving heretics broke and ran when they saw her approaching, floating through the air with her weapons blazing. But there was no escape within the cathedral walls. She hunted them through every chapel and corridor, every hidden chamber and sacred vault, until none remained to pollute the Emperor's house with their presence. When the killing was finished, when the last traitor's blood had been spilled across the marble floors, Celestine found herself alone in the cathedral's main chamber, surrounded by the bodies of both heretics and faithful alike. The golden light that had sustained her through the battle began to fade, and for a moment she feared that the miraculous presence would abandon her entirely. But it did not leave. Instead, it settled into her bones like warmth from a perfect fire, becoming part of her in a way that she knew would never fade. She was changed, transformed beyond any possibility of return to her former state. The Emperor had chosen her for something greater than ordinary service. Though she did not yet understand what that purpose might be, she knelt among the dead and began to pray again, not for herself but for the souls of her fallen sisters, that they might find peace in the Emperor's presence and know that their sacrifice had not been in vain. As she prayed, she became aware that she was no longer alone in the cathedral. They came through the broken doors like whispers given form, translucent figures that moved with the grace of remembered faith. Her sisters, the ones who had died during the night's fighting, stood before her with faces serene and eyes bright with inner light. They were dead, she knew that with absolute certainty, but they were also somehow present in a way that transcended the simple division between life and death. "Sister Celestine," one of them spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that no living throat could produce. "The Emperor has marked you for great purpose. You will carry his light to the darkest corners of the galaxy, and where you walk, the faithful will know hope again." "But why me?" Celestine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am nothing special. I have done nothing to earn such grace." "It is not earned," another spirit replied. "It is given freely to those who have proven their devotion absolute. You died tonight, sister. Died truly and completely when the heretic's blade should have taken your head. But the Emperor would not permit your soul to depart, for he has need of your service yet." The words sent ice through her veins. She had died. Somehow, in ways she could not fully comprehend, she had crossed the barrier between life and death and been sent back with purpose that transcended mortal understanding. She was no longer simply a living being serving the Emperor's will. She was something else entirely. "What am I?" she asked. "You are his saint," the first spirit answered. "His living miracle, proof that faith can triumph over any darkness. Through you, he will work wonders that will inspire the faithful and strike terror into the hearts of his enemies. But remember always that this gift comes with price. You belong no longer to yourself, but to him and to humanity. Your life, your death, your very existence serve purposes beyond your comprehension. The spirits began to fade as dawn light crept through the cathedral's broken windows, but their final words remained clear in her mind. Go now, Saint Celestine. Your war is just beginning. She left Ophelia 7th on a transport ship that arrived 3 days later, carrying relief forces that found nothing but bodies and the lingering scent of sanctified air. The canoness who led the relief force tried to question Celestine about what had happened, but found herself unable to speak in the presence of the golden light that seemed to emanate from the young sister's very skin. Instead, she simply knelt and offered her blessing, recognizing without fully understanding that she was in the presence of something miraculous. News of the events on Ophelia 7th spread through the ecclesiarchy like wildfire, carried by astropathic communications and whispered rumors that grew in the telling. A sister of battle had single-handedly defeated an entire heretic force that had overrun a cathedral world. She had been seen floating through the air, glowing with inner light, striking down enemies with divine precision. Such stories would normally be dismissed as propaganda or wishful thinking, the kind of inspiring tales that were useful for maintaining morale, but had little basis in observed reality. But there were too many witnesses, too many confirmed details, too much evidence of genuine miraculous intervention for the reports to be easily discounted. More importantly, similar incidents began occurring wherever Sister Celestine appeared. Her first official assignment came from the Cardinal of Obscura sector, who had been dealing with an uprising on the Forge world of Metallica. Chaos cultists had infiltrated the planet's worker populations and were conducting sabotage operations that threatened critical manufacturing facilities. Local forces had been unable to root out the infiltrators, who seemed to possess supernatural knowledge of Imperial defense plans and could strike at will before vanishing back into the vast industrial complexes. The Cardinal requested a single Sister of Battle to serve as his personal spiritual advisor during the campaign, specifically asking for Sister Celestine based on reports of her exceptional devotion and purity of faith. He had no idea what he was actually summoning to his aid. Celestine arrived on Metallica aboard a Navy transport, traveling in a simple cabin with no special accommodations or recognition of her unique status. She spent the journey in prayer and meditation, preparing herself for whatever service the Emperor might require. The golden light within her had stabilized during the weeks since Ophelia 7th, becoming a constant presence that filled her with strength and purpose. But she still did not fully understand what she had become or what she was expected to accomplish. The Forge world itself was a monument to Imperial industrial capacity, its surface covered with manufactorums and refineries that stretched from horizon to horizon. Billions of workers toiled in its factories, producing everything from ammunition to armor plating to the sacred machines that powered the Imperium's war effort. The very air hummed with the sound of blessed machinery operating at full capacity, a technological symphony that should have been deeply reassuring to any faithful servant of the Emperor. But something was wrong. Celestine could feel it the moment she stepped off the transport, a spiritual corruption that infected the planet's very atmosphere. The workers moved with mechanical precision, but their eyes held no spark of genuine humanity. The machines operated efficiently, but their machine spirits seemed somehow muted, as if they were being forced to function against their natural inclinations. Cardinal Dawn met her at the spaceport, an elderly man whose magnificent robes could not disguise the exhaustion that marked his features. He had been fighting this campaign for months without significant progress, watching his forces slowly ground down by an enemy that could strike anywhere while remaining essentially invisible. "Sister Celestine," he said, offering the appropriate blessing. "I have heard remarkable things about your service on Ophelia 7th. I pray that your presence here will help us cleanse this world of the taint that has taken root in its foundations." "The Emperor's will shall be done," Celestine replied, though she found herself studying the cardinal with new perception that revealed layers of meaning beneath his words. He was faithful, genuinely devoted to the imperial cause, but he was also desperate. His previous strategies had failed, and he was grasping for any solution that might break the deadlock. "Tell me about the enemy," she continued. "What have you learned about their organization and capabilities?" The cardinal's briefing revealed a pattern of corruption that was both sophisticated and deeply troubling. The Chaos cultists had not simply infiltrated the worker populations. They had somehow convinced large sections of the planetary government that their cause was righteous. Officials who had served loyally for decades were now actively obstructing imperial military operations while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. "They speak of a new age of freedom from the Emperor's tyranny," Cardinal Dawn explained, his voice heavy with disgust. "They claim that the workers of Metallica deserve to control their own destiny rather than serving as tools for the imperial war machine. Such blasphemy would normally be easily exposed and punished, but they have been remarkably successful at avoiding our security forces." Celestine listened to the briefing with growing understanding of what she was facing. This was not a simple rebellion or even ordinary chaos corruption. The enemy was conducting a sophisticated psychological operation designed to undermine the spiritual foundations of imperial authority while maintaining plausible deniability about their true allegiances. "I will need to see the affected areas for myself," she said. "Take me to where the corruption is strongest." What she found in the lower levels of Hive Metallica was worse than even the Cardinal's reports had suggested. Entire districts had been transformed into something that barely resembled imperial civilization. The worker populations moved through their daily routines with mechanical efficiency, but their faces showed no joy, no hope, no spark of the human spirit that should have characterized faithful imperial citizens. More disturbing still were the subtle changes to the sacred imagery that decorated public spaces. Imperial Aquilus had been modified with additional symbols that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Portraits of the Emperor had been altered in ways that maintained their apparent reverence while somehow conveying entirely different meanings. The corruption was spiritual rather than obvious, designed to slowly erode faith rather than challenge it directly. Workers continued to attend mandatory religious services, but the prayers they recited had been subtly changed to honor concepts that were decidedly un-imperial. They maintained productivity in the manufactorums, but the goods they produced were somehow wrong, tainted with influences that would spread their corruption to whoever used them. It was insidious, patient, and terrifyingly effective. Celestine spent 3 days moving through the affected districts, using her enhanced perceptions to identify the sources and patterns of the spiritual contamination. The golden light within her reacted to the chaos influences like a sacred flame responding to unclean air, growing brighter and more intense as she approached the strongest concentrations of corruption. On the 4th day, she found what she was looking for. Hidden beneath a seemingly loyal manufacturing complex was a temple dedicated to powers that should not be named. The chamber was vast, carved from the living rock of the planet's crust, and decorated with symbols that were painful to observe directly. At its center stood an altar where the cultists conducted their blasphemous rituals, sacrificing loyal imperial citizens to feed the dark hunger of their chosen gods. But the temple was empty when Celestine discovered it, abandoned as if its occupants had fled moments before her arrival. Only one figure remained, kneeling before the altar in robes that bore the insignia of a chaos sorcerer. When he turned to face her, she saw that his features had been completely replaced by writhing tentacles that moved independently of any earthly anatomy. "So," the creature said, its voice emerging from multiple mouths that opened and closed among the tentacles. "The corpse god sends his little miracle to oppose us. How delightfully predictable." Celestine drew her bolt pistol and power sword, the blessed weapons humming with eagerness for combat against such obvious evil. But even as she prepared to fight, she found herself studying the sorcerer with the enhanced perception that had become part of her nature. He was not the true enemy, not the mind behind the corruption that had infected Metallica. He was merely another tool, more sophisticated than the deluded workers, but ultimately no more important than any other instrument of chaos influence. "Where is your master?" she demanded, her voice carrying harmonics that made the temple's corrupted stone walls vibrate in response. The sorcerer laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming children. "Master, we serve no mortal master, little saint. We serve the eternal powers that existed before your emperor drew breath and will endure long after his corpse finally crumbles to dust." "You lie," Celestine replied, advancing toward the altar with her weapons ready. "Someone coordinates your operations. Someone with intelligence and authority directs your movements. Tell me who, and your death will be swift." "Death?" The sorcerer's tentacles writhed with what might have been amusement. "You think in such limited terms. Death is merely transition, a doorway between states of existence. We have already died, little saint. We died long ago, and found that death is not the ending that imperial propaganda claims." He gestured to the altar, and Celestine saw that it was covered with fresh blood that still steamed in the temple's corrupted air. The blood of imperial citizens, she realized. Workers and officials who had been sacrificed to fuel whatever ritual the cultists had been conducting. "Every drop spilled here feeds the great working," the sorcerer continued. "Every soul torn from flesh adds its strength to the pattern we are weaving across this world. Soon Metallica will be reborn as something magnificent, a planet where the blessing of chaos flows freely and the chains of imperial dogma are finally broken." Celestine had heard enough. She triggered her jump pack and launched herself across the temple chamber, her power sword crackling with blessed energy as it cleaved through the air toward the sorcerer's center mass. But the blade passed through empty space where the creature had been standing, and she found herself fighting not one enemy, but dozens. The sorcerer had been a projection, an illusion designed to distract her while the real cultists prepared their trap. They emerged from hidden alcoves throughout the temple, firing weapons both conventional and blasphemous as they attempted to bring down the Emperor's saint. Last fire and bolt rounds mixed with streams of warp energy that sought to corrupt her flesh as they destroyed it. Celestine danced between the attacks with grace that transcended mortal limitations, her body moving in patterns that seemed to anticipate her enemy's actions before they occurred. The golden light within her blazed brighter as combat intensified, until she was glowing like a miniature star in the darkness of the corrupted temple. Her return fire was devastating. Each shot from her bolt pistol found its target with supernatural precision, punching through armor and flesh with equal ease. Her power sword carved through cultist bodies as if they were made of paper, its blessed blade leaving trails of purifying fire in the air. But there were too many of them, and they kept emerging from concealment faster than she could destroy them. Worse, she began to realize that they were not trying to kill her so much as delay her, keeping her occupied while something else unfolded elsewhere in the temple complex. The revelation came to her through the enhanced spiritual perception that had become part of her nature since Ophelia 7th. Below the temple chamber, in caverns that had been carved from solid rock, the cultists were conducting a ritual of such magnitude that it threatened to corrupt not just Metallica, but neighboring star systems as well. They were opening a permanent gateway to the warp, creating a stable passage through which the forces of chaos could pour into real space without the usual limitations of time and distance. If they succeeded, Metallica would become a daemon world, a permanent staging ground for chaos operations throughout the sector. Celestine fought her way through the remaining cultists and descended into the lower caverns, following passages that seemed to twist and bend in ways that violated physical laws. The corruption grew stronger as she went deeper, until the very air seemed thick with malevolent presence that pressed against her consciousness like a physical weight. The ritual chamber was vast beyond comprehension, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. At its center, 100 chaos sorcerers stood in perfect formation around a gateway that pulsed with energies drawn from the deepest hells of the warp. Through the gateway, she could see horrors beyond description, demon legions marshalling for invasion, chaos space marines preparing for war, the twisted forms of corrupted imperial forces who had fallen to the darkness in previous campaigns. All of them waiting for the portal to stabilize so they could pour through into real space and begin the conquest of the sector. The lead sorcerer, a figure whose robes concealed anatomy that was no longer remotely human, turned to face her as she entered the chamber. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of something that had once commanded armies in the Emperor's name before falling to corruption. "Sister Celestine," he said, his words echoing with harmonics that made the cavern walls tremble. "We have been expecting you. Your presence here completes the final component of our working." "I will stop you," Celestine replied, though she could see that she was vastly outnumbered by enemies whose power far exceeded anything she had faced before. "Stop us?" The sorcerer laughed, and the sound was like worlds dying in the void. "You misunderstand your role in these events. We do not fear your intervention. We require it. Your presence here, your pure faith burning bright in this place of chaos, provides the spiritual tension necessary to anchor our gateway in real space." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had been manipulated, drawn to this place not to prevent the ritual, but to enable it. Her very nature as a living saint, her connection to the Emperor's divine power, was being used as a component in the chaos working. "The more brightly you burn with righteous fury," the sorcerer continued, "the more stable our portal becomes. Fight us, and you help us. Flee, and you abandon this world to corruption. Either way, we achieve our purpose." Celestine stood motionless for a moment, trapped by the perfect logic of the chaos trap. Every option available to her served the enemy's goals. If she fought, her spiritual energy would power their ritual. If she retreated, they would complete their working unopposed. But as she contemplated her situation, she became aware of another presence in the chamber. Something vast and benevolent that looked upon the chaos ritual with infinite distaste. The Emperor himself, reaching across space and time to offer guidance to his chosen servant. Through that divine connection, she understood what needed to be done. Instead of fighting the sorcerers or fleeing from their trap, Celestine began to pray. Not the formal words of liturgy that she had memorized during her training, but a personal conversation with the master of mankind himself. She opened her soul completely to his presence, holding nothing back, offering herself as a pure channel for divine will. The golden light within her exploded outward, filling the ritual chamber with radiance that made the chaos sorcerers stagger backward in pain and confusion. But this was not the destructive energy of weapons or the consuming fire of righteous anger. This was something far more dangerous to the forces of chaos. This was hope. Pure, undiluted hope radiating from her in waves that washed over everyone in the chamber. Hope for redemption, hope for salvation. Hope that even the darkest corruption could be cleansed if the will to change was genuine. The chaos gateway began to fluctuate as the warp energies that powered it encountered something they could not corrupt or control. Hope was antithetical to chaos, a force that thrived on despair and corruption, but withered in the presence of genuine optimism about the future. Several of the lesser sorcerers fell to their knees, their faces twisted with expressions of profound confusion as they experienced emotions they had not felt in centuries. For a brief moment, they remembered what it had been like to serve the Emperor with genuine devotion, to believe that they were fighting for something greater than personal power. The leered sorcerer raised his staff and began chanting in the demon tongue, trying to maintain control over the ritual as it spiraled beyond his ability to direct. But his words faltered as the hope radiating from Celestine reached into the deepest parts of his consciousness, touching fragments of the man he had been before his fall to chaos. "No," he whispered, though whether he was rejecting Celestine's influence or his own memories was unclear. "I am beyond redemption. I have done things that cannot be forgiven." "Forgiveness is the Emperor's to grant," Celestine replied, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond the physical. "But it is offered freely to those who genuinely repent." The gateway began to collapse as the spiritual energies that anchored it dissolved under the assault of pure hope. The demon legions waiting beyond screamed their frustration as the portal that would have granted them access to real space crumbled into nothingness. But the sorcerers were not finished. Those who retained enough of their original corruption began a desperate counterattack, pouring every ounce of their accumulated power into one final attempt to complete their working. The chamber erupted in violence as chaos energies clashed with divine radiance. Walls cracked under the strain of competing spiritual forces, and reality itself began to warp as the fundamental laws of physics struggled to accommodate powers that should not exist in the same space. Celestine found herself at the center of a storm that threatened to tear her apart on the molecular level. The hope she radiated was holding the chaos forces at bay, but the effort was consuming her physical form like fuel in a fire. She could feel herself beginning to fade, her mortal flesh unable to channel such massive spiritual energies without consequence. But even as her body failed, she held nothing back. If her death was required to prevent the corruption of Metallica, then she would die gladly. The Emperor had already granted her one miracle by allowing her to serve beyond her natural lifespan. She could ask for no more. The explosion, when it came, was not of destructive force but of purifying light. The entire ritual chamber filled with radiance so intense that it burned away every trace of chaos corruption, leaving only clean stone and empty air. When the light faded, the sorcerers were gone, not destroyed exactly, but transformed back into what they had been before their fall to chaos. Ordinary men, confused and ashamed, standing in the ruins of their blasphemous temple with no memory of how they had arrived there. Celestine herself lay at the center of the chamber, her body apparently lifeless, but the golden light still flickered within her, dimmed but not extinguished. She had died again, truly and completely, but death was becoming a temporary state for the Emperor's chosen saint. Cardinal Dawn found her 3 hours later, led to the hidden temple by dreams that he later swore had been sent directly by the Emperor. She was breathing when he arrived, though her pulse was so faint as to be barely detectable. "Sister Celestine," he whispered, kneeling beside her still form. "What have you done?" Her eyes opened, blazing with inner fire that had become her most distinctive feature. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the cavern walls resonate in sympathy. "The Emperor's will," she replied simply. Recovery took weeks, during which Celestine remained in a state that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. Her body healed from injuries that should have been fatal, while her spirit gradually reintegrated with flesh that had been fundamentally changed by exposure to pure divine energy. When she finally rose from her bed of healing, she was no longer quite the same being who had descended into the Chaos Temple. The golden light within her had stabilized at a level that made her glow with constant inner radiance. Her hair had become threads of spun gold that moved in winds no mortal could feel. Her eyes blazed with fires that could inspire the faithful and terrify the corrupt. Most remarkably, she had gained the ability to manifest wings of pure light when combat or other circumstances required. The wings were not physical constructs, but expressions of spiritual energy that allowed her to move through three-dimensional space with perfect freedom. Cardinal Dawn declared her actions on Metallica to be a genuine miracle, the first confirmed appearance of a living saint in over 1,000 years. The news spread through the ecclesiarchy and beyond, carried by astropathic communications to every corner of imperial space. Sister Celestine had become Saint Celestine, the Emperor's chosen avatar of hope in a galaxy drowning in darkness. But her elevation to sainthood brought new challenges and responsibilities that tested her in ways she had never experienced as an ordinary battle sister. She was no longer simply a soldier serving in the Emperor's armies. She had become a symbol, a living embodiment of imperial faith whose every action would be scrutinized for signs of divine favor or disfavor. The ecclesiarchy assigned her a retinue of the most faithful and capable sisters they could find, warriors who had proven their devotion beyond question and could be trusted to support a living saint in her missions. Chief among them were Sisters Genevieve and Eleanor, veterans of countless campaigns who had distinguished themselves through skill, courage, and absolute loyalty to the imperial cause. Together they formed the core of what would become known as the Celestian Guard, an elite formation dedicated to supporting Saint Celestine in whatever missions the Emperor saw fit to assign. But their first campaign together would test the limits of their faith and their understanding of what it meant to serve a living miracle. The call came from the shrine world of Gthalamore, where a massive chaos incursion had overwhelmed the planetary defense forces and was threatening to desecrate some of the most sacred sites in the sector. The enemy was led by a fallen Astartes chapter known as the Violators, Chaos Space Marines whose corruption ran so deep that they had become living blasphemies against everything the Imperium held sacred. Celestine and her retinue arrived on Gthalamore to find a world in flames. The great cathedrals that had stood for millennia were broken shells, their sacred relics scattered and defiled by enemies who took obscene pleasure in destroying beautiful things. Millions of pilgrims who had come to the shrine world seeking spiritual comfort lay dead in the streets, their bodies arranged in patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate. But the worst atrocity was still unfolding in the Cathedral of St. Euphrates, where the Chaos forces had captured several thousand faithful imperial citizens and were using them as raw material for a ritual designed to summon something from the deepest reaches of the warp. "We have to stop them," Sister Genevieve said, as they observed the cathedral from a distance, studying the Chaos positions and trying to determine the best approach. "Agreed," Celestine replied, though her enhanced perceptions were picking up details that troubled her deeply. "But this is not a simple rescue operation. The ritual they are conducting will summon something that could threaten far more than this single world." Through her connection to the Emperor's divine will, she could sense the shape of what the Chaos forces were attempting to create. Not a daemon, though that would have been terrible enough, but something worse. They were trying to tear a permanent hole in reality itself, creating a wound in the fabric of space and time that would allow the warp to bleed directly into the material universe. If they succeeded, Gthalamore would become a permanent chaos stronghold from which corruption could spread throughout the sector. Worse still, the ritual would serve as a template that could be replicated on other worlds, potentially creating a network of warp breaches that would make large portions of imperial space uninhabitable. "How many enemies are we facing?" Sister Eleanor asked, checking her bolt pistol's ammunition load as she prepared for what promised to be a desperate fight. Celestine closed her eyes and extended her spiritual senses throughout the cathedral complex, using her connection to divine power to pierce the veils of concealment that the Chaos forces had erected around their positions. 3 companies of Chaos Space Marines, she reported, supported by several thousand cultists and at least a dozen demon engines. They have positioned themselves to defend the ritual chamber while their sorcerers complete the summoning. The numbers were overwhelming for a force consisting of 1 saint and 2 battle sisters, no matter how blessed their cause or how pure their faith. But Celestine had learned on Metallica that sometimes the Emperor's will required actions that seemed impossible from a purely tactical perspective. "We will not assault their positions directly," she continued, formulating a plan that drew upon insights that came from sources beyond mortal understanding. "Instead, we will strike at the spiritual foundations of their working." The Cathedral of St. Euphrati had been built over a convergence of ley lines, natural channels of spiritual energy that ran through the planet's crust, like veins carrying the lifeblood of faith itself. The Chaos forces were using these ley lines to power their ritual, drawing upon energies that had been sanctified by millennia of imperial worship. But ley lines could be redirected, their flow altered by someone with sufficient spiritual authority and understanding of their operation. If Celestine could reach the cathedral's main altar and perform the appropriate rituals, she could turn the Chaos Force's own power source against them. "The risk is enormous," she explained to her companions as they prepared for infiltration. "If I fail to properly redirect the energy flow, the resulting explosion could level half the continent." "And if we do nothing?" Sister Genevieve asked. "The Chaos ritual succeeds, and we lose far more than one world," Celestine replied grimly. They entered the cathedral through maintenance tunnels that had been carved beneath the structure during its original construction. The passages were narrow and dark, filled with the accumulated dust of centuries and the lingering scent of sanctified incense. But they also carried echoes of the prayers that had been offered in the chambers above, spiritual resonances that strengthened Celestine's connection to divine power. As they moved deeper into the cathedral complex, the sounds of the Chaos ritual grew louder and more disturbing, chanting in languages that should not be spoken by human voices, accompanied by screams that could only come from the imperial citizens being sacrificed to fuel the summoning. "Stay close," Celestine whispered as they approached the main chamber. "The corruption here is strong enough to taint anyone who lacks sufficient spiritual protection." The cathedral's interior was a scene from the deepest nightmares of imperial propagandists. The Chaos Space Marines had transformed the sacred space into a blasphemous temple, covering the walls with symbols that writhed and changed when observed directly. The beautiful stained glass windows had been replaced with viewing portals that showed landscapes from demon worlds, vistas of endless torment that served as inspiration for the rituals being conducted. At the center of the chamber, a massive altar had been constructed from the bones of the faithful. Upon it lay a dozen imperial citizens, still alive but held motionless by warp energies, while Chaos sorcerers prepared to sacrifice them in the final phase of their ritual. The violators themselves stood guard around the altar, their armor decorated with trophies taken from loyalist space marines they had killed in previous campaigns. Their presence filled the cathedral with an aura of malevolence so intense that normal humans would have fled in terror or collapsed into gibbering madness. Celestine observed the scene with enhanced perception that allowed her to see beyond the physical arrangement of enemies and obstacles. The ley lines converged directly beneath the altar, their energies flowing upward to power the Chaos ritual. If she could disrupt that flow, redirect it through the cathedral's original consecrated channels, she could turn the accumulated spiritual power against the Chaos forces. But reaching the altar would require fighting through 3 companies of Chaos Space Marines, an impossible task for any mortal force. "I need a distraction," she told her companions. "Something that will draw their attention away from the altar long enough for me to reach the ley line convergence." Sister Genevieve and Sister Eleanor exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their understanding of what such a distraction would cost them. They were being asked to sacrifice themselves to buy their saint the few minutes she needed to complete her mission. "It will be an honor," Sister Genevieve replied simply. "The Emperor protects," Sister Eleanor added, checking her weapons one final time. They emerged from concealment at opposite ends of the cathedral, their bolt pistols blazing as they engaged the Chaos forces with absolutely no regard for their own survival. Their fire was disciplined and effective, each shot carefully aimed to inflict maximum damage on the most important targets they could identify. The Chaos Space Marines responded immediately, turning their attention from the ritual to engage these unexpected attackers. Bolt rounds and plasma blasts filled the air as the traitor Astartes sought to eliminate the threats to their working. Sister Genevieve took cover behind a fallen pillar and maintained steady fire until a Chaos Marine with a plasma gun vaporized her position in a flash of superheated energy. She died instantly, her sacrifice buying precious seconds for Celestine's advance. Sister Eleanor lasted longer, using her jump pack to maintain mobility while engaging multiple enemies simultaneously, but weight of numbers eventually told, and she fell beneath the combined fire of an entire squad of Chaos Marines. Their deaths were not in vain. In the confusion of the firefight, Celestine reached the altar undetected and placed her hands upon the convergence point where the ley lines met. Through her connection to divine power, she began the complex ritual necessary to redirect their energy flow. The process was agonizing. The ley lines carried not just spiritual energy, but also the accumulated corruption of the chaos ritual. Tainted power that burned her flesh like acid as it flowed through her body. But she held nothing back, pouring her own life force into the working, as she fought to overcome the spiritual momentum of the chaos summoning. The lead chaos sorcerer realized what was happening when the ritual energies began to fluctuate wildly. He turned from his blasphemous prayers to face the saint who was destroying his life's work, his features twisted with rage that transcended mortal emotion. "Impossible!" he snarled, raising his staff to direct devastating warp energies at Celestine's position. "You cannot overcome powers that have been building for decades." "I do not need to overcome them," Celestine replied, her voice carrying harmonics that made the cathedral walls resonate in sympathy. "I merely need to redirect them." The redirected ley line energy erupted from the altar like a geyser of pure divine power, washing over the chaos forces with purifying radiance that burned away corruption wherever it touched. The Chaos Space Marines staggered backward, their armor smoking as the blessed energy ate through centuries of accumulated taint. But the purification process was not gentle. The corrupted Marines screamed as the warp energies that had sustained their enhanced physiology for so long were suddenly stripped away, leaving them as mortal men in armor that no longer fit their reduced forms. The sorcerers suffered worst of all. Their bodies had been so thoroughly changed by chaos corruption that removing it left them as little more than organic slurry contained within their power armor. They collapsed one by one, their death cries echoing through the cathedral as their souls were finally released from the torment of service to the dark powers. When the purification was complete, when the last trace of chaos corruption had been burned away by redirected divine energy, Celestine found herself alone in the cathedral with the imperial citizens who had been intended as sacrifices. They were alive, unmarked by the corruption that had surrounded them, protected by the same energies that had destroyed their captors. But the effort of redirecting the ley lines had consumed her mortal form once again. She lay beside the altar, her body apparently lifeless, though the golden light within her continued to flicker with determination that transcended physical death. The survivors found her there when the Imperial relief forces finally reached the cathedral. They spoke in whispered tones of the miracle they had witnessed, of the saint who had died to save them from a fate worse than death. But death, as always, was only temporary for the Emperor's chosen avatar. She rose 3 days later, her body restored and enhanced by exposure to the purified ley line energies. The golden light within her had grown stronger, and she had gained new abilities that manifested as her connection to divine power deepened. Most notably, she had developed the capacity to resurrect the faithful dead, bringing back those whose pure souls the Emperor deemed worthy of continued service. Sisters Genevieve and Eleanor were the first to benefit from this new gift, rising from death with memories of the Emperor's presence and renewed dedication to their saint's mission. News of the miracle on Gthalamore spread throughout the Imperium faster than astropathic communications could carry it. The resurrection of faithful servants was unprecedented, a sign of divine favor that had not been seen since the days of the Great Crusade. Saint Celestine had become more than just a living saint. She had become proof that the Emperor was not simply a distant figure on a golden throne, but an active presence in the galaxy who could work miracles through those worthy of his grace. But with greater power came greater responsibility and greater scrutiny from forces both loyal and treacherous. The Inquisition began to take notice of Saint Celestine's activities, sending representatives to observe her missions and evaluate whether her powers represented genuine divine intervention or something more dangerous. The first Inquisitor to make contact was Greyfax of the Ordo Hereticus, a woman whose dedication to rooting out corruption was matched only by her suspicion of anything that claimed divine authority. She arrived on Gthalamore shortly after the cathedral incident, accompanied by a retinue of the most fanatical witch hunters the Inquisition could provide. "Saint Celestine," Greyfax said when they met in the ruins of the purified cathedral, "I have come to witness your works and determine their true nature." "You are welcome to observe," Celestine replied, though her enhanced perceptions picked up details about the Inquisitor that were deeply troubling. Greyfax was faithful, genuinely devoted to the Emperor's service, but her soul carried scars from encounters with corruption that had left her suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. "Your abilities are remarkable," the Inquisitor continued, studying Celestine with eyes that missed no detail. "The resurrection of the dead, the purification of chaos taint, the manifestation of divine energy, such powers have not been seen in thousands of years." "The Emperor grants what is needed," Celestine replied simply. "Perhaps," Greyfax said, "but throughout history, many who claim divine mandate have proven to be agents of corruption in disguise. The most dangerous heretics are often those who believe themselves to be righteous." The accusation hung in the air between them, a reminder that even miracles could be questioned by those whose duty was to guard against deception. Celestine understood the Inquisitor's suspicion and did not resent it. In a galaxy where corruption could wear any face and speak any words, extreme caution was not merely justified, but essential. "Test me," Celestine offered. "Use whatever methods you deem necessary to verify the source of my abilities." What followed was the most thorough spiritual examination in Imperial history. Greyfax subjected Celestine to every test known to the Inquisition, from simple purity seals to complex rituals designed to detect the slightest trace of chaos taint. The results were unambiguous. Whatever powered Saint Celestine's abilities, it was absolutely pure, untainted by any corruption or deception. Her connection to the Emperor was genuine, her divine mandate authentic, but the testing process revealed something else that gave Greyfax pause. Celestine's powers were growing stronger with each resurrection, each miracle, each act of divine intervention. The golden light within her was accumulating energy at a rate that suggested she might eventually transcend the boundaries of mortal existence entirely. "What happens when your transformation is complete?" Greyfax asked during their final interview. "When you become something that is no longer human in any meaningful sense." "I serve the Emperor's will," Celestine replied. "Whatever form that service takes, whatever sacrifices it requires, I accept gladly. Even if it means losing your humanity entirely. Humanity is not defined by flesh and bone, Celestine said. It is defined by the choices we make, the values we uphold, the love we bear for our fellow beings. As long as I retain those qualities, I remain human regardless of what changes my body may undergo. Greyfax's final report to the Inquisition declared Saint Celestine to be genuine and untainted, a true miracle worthy of imperial veneration. But privately, the Inquisitor remained troubled by the implications of what she had witnessed. Saints were supposed to be rare, appearing perhaps once in a millennium to provide hope during the darkest times. But Celestine's rapid development suggested that the galaxy was entering a period of such extreme crisis that the Emperor was being forced to take direct action through his chosen servants. What threats could be so severe that they required intervention on such a scale? The answer came from the Eye of Terror, where the forces of chaos were marshalling for their largest offensive in 10,000 years. Led by Abaddon the Despoiler, the greatest of Chaos champions, an enormous fleet was preparing to launch what would become known as the 13th Black Crusade. Their target was not some distant world or isolated system, but Cadia itself, the fortress world that guarded the only stable passage out of the Eye of Terror. If Cadia fell, the forces of chaos would pour into Imperial space in numbers that could threaten the stability of the entire galaxy. Every available Imperial force was being redirected to defend Cadia, from Space Marine chapters to Imperial Guard regiments to the sacred orders of the Astra Militarum. But High Command knew that conventional forces alone would not be sufficient to repel an assault of such magnitude. They needed miracles. They needed saints. They needed Saint Celestine. The call came directly from War Master Macarius himself, the supreme commander of Imperial forces throughout the sector. His message was brief, but carried the weight of absolute authority. Saint Celestine, your Emperor has need of you. Come to Cadia immediately. Bring whatever forces you can muster. The fate of the Imperium may depend on your presence. Celestine received the message while on the shrine world of Ophelia Septimus, where she had been conducting purification rituals to cleanse lingering traces of chaos, corruption from previous conflicts. Her retinue had grown to include dozens of the most faithful and capable sisters in the Imperium, warriors who had proven their devotion through service alongside the living saint. "Cadia," Sister Genevieve said when she heard their destination. "The fortress world itself. If the enemy is targeting Cadia, then this is no ordinary assault. The Emperor would not have granted me these abilities if they were not needed for the trials ahead," Celestine replied. "We go where duty calls, regardless of the dangers we may face." The journey to Cadia took them through warp space that had become increasingly turbulent as the forces of chaos gathered their strength. Their ship, a modified cruiser that had been blessed by the highest authorities in the ecclesiarchy, struggled against warp storms that seemed designed to prevent reinforcements from reaching the fortress world. But divine will proved stronger than chaotic interference. They emerged from the warp to find Cadia surrounded by the largest fleet any of them had ever seen. Thousands of Imperial ships from across the galaxy hung in orbit around the fortress world, their combined firepower representing the most concentrated military force in human history. But arrayed against them was something even more impressive. The Chaos Fleet emerging from the Eye of Terror stretched beyond the horizon. Ship after ship bearing the marks of traitor legions that had fought against the Emperor since the days of the Horus Heresy. At the center of the Chaos formation was the vengeful spirit itself, Abaddon's flagship, and the vessel from which the arch-traitor Horus had launched his assault on Terra 10,000 years before. The ship radiated malevolence so intense that even Celestine could feel it from across the system, a spiritual poison that threatened to corrupt everything it touched. "My God," Sister Eleanor whispered as they observed the enemy fleet. How can we possibly stand against such numbers? We do not stand against them alone, Celestine replied, though she too was awed by the scale of the forces arrayed against Cadia. We fight alongside every loyal servant of the Emperor, living and dead, mortal and divine. The surface of Cadia was a fortress continent, its entire landmass covered with defensive installations that had been built and rebuilt over 10 millennia of warfare. Mighty walls surrounded cities that were themselves armed camps, while underground bunkers and tunnel systems provided fallback positions for defenders who refused to yield. But even Cadia's legendary defenses seemed inadequate when faced with the overwhelming force that Abaddon had assembled. The initial orbital bombardment alone was more intense than anything the fortress world had ever endured, raining destruction from the heavens with such concentrated fury that entire mountain ranges were leveled in the first hour of combat. Celestine and her retinue made planetfall at Casa Kraf, one of the primary defensive installations, where they were met by General Creed himself, the supreme commander of Cadian forces and one of the finest tactical minds in the Imperial Guard. "Saint Celestine," he said, offering the proper blessing despite the urgency of the situation. "Your presence here is a gift from the Emperor himself. We will have need of every miracle you can provide." "Tell me how I can best serve," Celestine replied, studying the tactical displays that showed the chaos assault developing on multiple fronts simultaneously. "The enemy is not merely seeking to conquer Cadia," Creed explained. "They are trying to destroy it completely, to shatter the planet itself so that it can no longer serve as a barrier against chaos expansion. They have brought weapons of such power that they threaten the very stability of the world." Through the command center's viewing ports, Celestine could see the chaos forces making their first assault landings. Drop pods and landing craft descended through the defensive fire like metal rain, while gargantuan titans strode across the landscape, their weapons carving valleys in the planet's surface. But most disturbing of all were the demon engines, mechanical horrors that combined the worst aspects of technology and warp-spawned entities. The plan that developed over the following hours was audacious to the point of madness. These creatures moved with inhuman intelligence, adapting their tactics in real time as they encountered resistance, learning from each engagement to become more effective killers. "We need to strike at their command structure," Celestine said, her enhanced perceptions picking up details about the chaos assault that conventional intelligence gathering could not detect. "Abaddon is coordinating this attack personally, drawing upon powers that transcend normal battlefield communication. He is aboard the Vengeful Spirit," General Creed replied, "beyond the reach of any conventional assault force." "Not beyond my reach," Celestine said quietly. While the Imperial forces engaged the Chaos ground assault in conventional combat, Celestine would lead a small strike force directly at the Vengeful Spirit itself, using her abilities to breach the flagship's defenses and confront Abaddon in personal combat. "You're talking about assaulting the most heavily defended ship in the Chaos fleet," Sister Genevieve pointed out. "Even with your abilities, the odds of success are minimal." "The odds of success for the entire defense are minimal," Celestine replied. "Unless we can disrupt Abaddon's control over his forces, Cadia will fall regardless of how bravely we fight on the surface." The strike force consisted of Celestine, her closest companions, and a handful of the most elite Imperial troops available. They would use a captured Chaos transport to approach the Vengeful Spirit, relying on confusion in the battle zone to mask their approach until they could board the flagship. The plan relied heavily on divine intervention to succeed, but that was exactly what Saint Celestine had been created to provide. They launched their assault during the height of the orbital battle, when the space around Cadia was so filled with ships and weapons fire that one additional vessel could pass unnoticed among the chaos. The captured transport carried them through the outer defensive screens of the Chaos fleet, its corrupted identification codes granting access to areas that would have been impossible to reach in an Imperial ship. But as they approached the vengeful spirit, Celestine began to sense the true nature of what they were facing. Abaddon was not simply commanding the chaos assault through normal military channels. He was using his connection to the dark powers to coordinate his forces directly, his will extending across the entire battlefield to guide every ship and trooper according to his tactical vision. More disturbing still, she could sense something else aboard the flagship, a presence so malevolent and powerful that it made even Abaddon seem insignificant by comparison. One of the Chaos Gods themselves was manifesting through the despoiler, using him as a conduit to directly influence the course of the battle. "This is not just a military assault," she told her companions as their transport docked with the vengeful spirit. "This is a direct challenge to the Emperor's authority, a test of strength between divine powers." The interior of the flagship was a monument to 10,000 years of chaos worship, its corridors decorated with trophies taken from worlds that had been ravaged during previous Black Crusades. The air itself was thick with corruption, so tainted with warp influence that normal humans would have been driven insane within minutes of exposure. But Celestine's presence pushed back the spiritual poison, creating a bubble of sanctified space around her strike force that allowed them to function normally despite the overwhelming corruption that surrounded them. They fought their way through the ship's defenders, facing Chaos Space Marines whose armor bore the marks of traitor legions that had been serving the Dark Powers since the Horus Heresy. These were not ordinary enemies, but veterans of countless campaigns, warriors whose skill and experience made them among the most dangerous fighters in the galaxy. But they had never faced a living saint in direct combat. Celestine moved through their defenses like a living flame, her weapons striking with precision that transcended mortal limitations, while her presence inspired her companions to feats of heroism that they had never thought possible. The battle through the ship's corridors was brutal and costly. Several of her retinue fell to enemy fire, their deaths buying precious time for the advance to continue. But each fallen sister was immediately resurrected by Celestine's divine power, rising from death with renewed determination to complete their mission. They reached the ship's command center to find Abaddon waiting for them, his massive form encased in the talon of Horus and surrounded by his most elite bodyguards. But it was immediately clear that they were not facing the despoiler alone. Something vast and malevolent looked out through his eyes, a presence that filled the chamber with spiritual pressure so intense that it was difficult to breathe. "So," Abaddon said, his voice carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce, "the corpse god sends his little miracle to challenge me directly. How perfectly predictable. I come to offer you one chance at redemption," Celestine replied, her own voice blazing with divine authority that made the chamber's walls resonate in response. "Abandon this assault, turn from the dark powers that corrupt you, and seek the Emperor's forgiveness." Abaddon laughed, and the sound was like worlds dying in the void. "Redemption? I am beyond such weakness. I have looked upon the true nature of the universe and embraced the only power that matters. Your Emperor is dead, little saint. He has been dead for 10,000 years. What you worship is nothing but a corpse sustained by the sacrificial death of 1,000 souls each day." "He lives," Celestine replied simply, "and through me, he will show you the price of betrayal." The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred aboard a starship. Divine power clashed with chaos corruption, as saint and arch-traitor fought for the soul of the galaxy itself. Celestine's weapons blazed with holy fire that could shatter the bonds between atoms, while Abaddon's talon of Horus channeled energies drawn from the deepest hells of the warp. The chamber around them began to warp and twist as reality struggled to accommodate forces that should not exist in the same space. Walls became liquid, gravity fluctuated wildly, and the very air caught fire as competing spiritual energies sought to impose their will upon the physical universe. But even as they fought, Celestine began to understand that this confrontation was serving a larger purpose. The clash between divine and chaotic power was creating resonances that extended far beyond the vengeful spirit, affecting the course of the battle throughout the entire Cadian system. Every blow she struck against Abaddon weakened the coordination of the Chaos assault, disrupting the dark communion that allowed him to command his forces with superhuman efficiency. Every wound she inflicted sent ripples of hope through the Imperial defenders, inspiring them to greater acts of heroism and sacrifice. She was not just fighting for her own victory, but serving as a focal point for the Emperor's will throughout the battle zone. Through her, divine power was flowing to every Imperial servant who needed strength to continue their resistance. But the effort was consuming her mortal form once again. The divine energies flowing through her were more intense than anything she had channeled before, burning through her flesh like fire through parchment. She could feel herself beginning to fade, her physical existence dissolving under the strain of serving as a conduit for such massive spiritual forces. Abaddon sensed her weakness and pressed his attack, his talon carving through her defenses to strike directly at her heart. The chaos weapon pierced her chest, its corrupted edges seeking to poison her soul as they destroyed her body. But as the talon entered her heart, something unexpected happened. Instead of dying, instead of falling to the Chaos Champion's ultimate attack, Celestine began to glow with light so intense that it was painful to observe directly. The Emperor himself was manifesting through her, using her willing sacrifice as an anchor point to project his presence directly into the material universe. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Master of Mankind spoke with his own voice, and the words he chose were directed at his greatest enemy. "Horus," the Emperor said, speaking through Celestine's lips while looking directly at Abaddon with eyes that blazed like stars. "My son, it is not too late. Even now, even after all you have done, redemption is possible if you truly desire it." The Chaos Champion staggered backward, his features twisted with emotions that transcended mortal understanding. For a moment, the dark powers that controlled him were overwhelmed by the direct presence of the Emperor, leaving only the fragment of Horus that still existed within Abaddon's corrupted soul. "Father," he whispered, his voice cracking with anguish that had been building for 10 millennia. I cannot. I have gone too far, done too much. There is no path back from what I have become." "There is always a path back," the Emperor replied through Celestine. "But it requires the courage to admit error, the strength to reject the easy lies of chaos, and the wisdom to choose hope over despair. Will you take that path, my son?" For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Abaddon wavered on the edge of redemption. The chamber around them held its breath as the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance of one soul's choice between salvation and damnation. But then the Chaos Gods reasserted their control, pouring their combined will through the conduits they had spent millennia carving into Abaddon's consciousness. The moment of weakness passed, replaced by fury so intense that it threatened to tear reality apart at the molecular level. "I am not your son," Abaddon snarled, his voice once again carrying the harmonics of pure chaos. "I am your nemesis, your destined destroyer, the instrument through which the old order will finally fall. This galaxy will burn before I permit you to reclaim it." The Emperor's presence began to fade as the massive spiritual effort required to manifest in the material universe reached its limits. But before he withdrew completely, he spoke one final time through Saint Celestine. "Then you have chosen your fate, Horus Lupercal, and I grieve for what you have become." The divine light winked out, leaving Celestine's body apparently lifeless on the chamber floor, while Abaddon stood victorious over her fallen form. But even in death, she had accomplished her mission. The disruption of the chaos coordination had given the Imperial forces the advantage they needed to turn the tide of battle. Across the Cadian system, Imperial ships began pressing their attacks with renewed vigor, while ground forces launched counter-offensives that pushed back the Chaos assault. The dark communion that had allowed Abaddon to coordinate his forces with supernatural efficiency was broken, leaving his commanders to rely on conventional communication methods that were far less effective. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Cadia itself was breaking apart under the strain of the massive bombardment, its crust cracking along fault lines that had been carved by 10,000 years of warfare. The fortress world that had guarded the gateway to Imperial space for so long was dying, its death throes threatening to take millions of defenders with it. It was then that the third miracle occurred. As Cadia began its final collapse, as the planet's death seemed certain, Saint Celestine rose one final time from her deathbed aboard the vengeful spirit. But this resurrection was different from all the others. Instead of simply returning to life in her original form, she underwent a transformation that elevated her beyond the boundaries of mortal existence entirely. Her body became pure light, a form of energy that could exist independently of physical matter while retaining all the consciousness and personality that defined her identity. She was no longer bound by the limitations of flesh and bone, no longer constrained by the need for air or food or rest. She had become something that transcended the traditional categories of life and death, mortality and divinity. She was Saint Celestine Ascendant, the Emperor's avenging angel made manifest in the material universe. In her new form, she reached out across space to embrace the dying world of Cadia, her presence surrounding the planet like a protective shell that held its breaking crust together through pure force of will. The millions of Imperial defenders still fighting on the surface found themselves shielded from the worst effects of the planetary collapse, given precious time to evacuate to orbital ships before the final catastrophe. But even her transcendent power could not save Cadia completely. The planet's death was too far advanced, its structural integrity too thoroughly compromised by the massive bombardment. All she could do was ease its passing and ensure that its defenders had the chance to escape before the end. As the last evacuation ships cleared the planet's atmosphere, as the final Imperial forces reached safety aboard the orbital fleet, Cadia finally succumbed to the wounds that had been inflicted upon it. The fortress world that had stood guard over the Eye of Terror for 10 millennia cracked apart in an explosion of light and energy that could be seen from neighboring star systems. But its death was not a defeat. In breaking apart, Cadia released spiritual energies that had been building within its crust for thousands of years, energies that had been sanctified by the faith and sacrifice of countless Imperial defenders. These energies spread throughout the system like a cleansing wave, burning away chaos corruption wherever they touched. The Chaos Fleet, caught in the expanding wave of purification, found their ship systems failing as the blessed energies ate through the taint that had accumulated in their hulls over millennia of service to the dark powers. Demon engines collapsed into component parts as the entities possessing them were banished back to the warp. Corrupted space marines found their enhanced physiology breaking down as the chaos mutations that sustained them were systematically purged. Even the vengeful spirit itself was not immune to the cleansing wave. Abaddon watched in fury as his flagship began to buckle under the assault of pure Imperial faith, its corrupted systems failing one by one as the spiritual poison that powered them was burned away. "Retreat," he commanded his forces, his voice carrying the bitter taste of defeat despite his apparent victory. "All ships withdraw to the Eye immediately." The Chaos Fleet fled into the warp, their assault broken not by conventional weapons, but by the spiritual explosion triggered by Cadia's death. The 13th Black Crusade had failed, turned back at the moment of apparent triumph by forces that transcended the boundaries of normal warfare. But the cost had been enormous. Cadia was gone, its strategic position lost forever. The Eye of Terror now had a clear path into Imperial space, removing the primary barrier that had contained chaos expansion for 10,000 years. Saint Celestine, floating in the void where Cadia had once stood, contemplated the implications of what had occurred. The galaxy had changed, shifted into a new configuration that would require different strategies and different sacrifices to defend. But the Emperor's will had been served. The greatest chaos assault in 10 millennia had been turned back, its coordination shattered by divine intervention operating through mortal instruments. The Imperium would survive to fight another day, protected by servants whose faith could work miracles when miracles were needed most. In the years that followed the fall of Cadia, Saint Celestine continued her mission throughout the galaxy, appearing wherever the forces of chaos threatened to overwhelm Imperial defenses. Her transcendent form allowed her to travel vast distances instantly, manifesting wherever she was needed most to turn the tide of battle through divine intervention. She fought alongside space marines on demon worlds where reality itself had been corrupted beyond recognition. She led Imperial Guard regiments in desperate last stands against impossible odds, her presence inspiring ordinary soldiers to feats of heroism that would be remembered for millennia. She purified corrupted worlds with waves of golden light that burned away chaos taint while leaving loyal Imperial citizens unharmed. But perhaps most importantly, she served as proof that the Emperor was not the distant, uncaring deity that his critics claimed. Through her actions, through her miracles, through her very existence, she demonstrated that the Master of Mankind was actively involved in the fate of his people, working through chosen servants to protect humanity from the darkness that surrounded it. The ecclesiarchy declared her the patron saint of hope, the divine advocate for all who fought against impossible odds in service of the imperial cause. Shrines were built in her honor on 1,000 worlds, each one a beacon of faith that reminded the faithful that no matter how dark the galaxy became, the Emperor's light would never be completely extinguished. Inquisitor Greyfax, who had spent years studying Saint Celestine and documenting her miracles, wrote in her final report, "She is what we all aspire to become, not simply human, but humanity elevated to its highest potential through absolute faith and perfect service. In her, we see proof that the Emperor's promise of transcendence is real, that mortal beings can become something greater through devotion to causes larger than themselves. She is hope made manifest, proof that no darkness is absolute, no corruption irreversible, no enemy undefeatable when faced with pure faith wielded by righteous will. As long as she fights, as long as her light burns in the void, the Imperium has reason to believe that its ultimate victory is not just possible, but inevitable. She is Saint Celestine, the Emperor's avenging angel, and she is exactly what the galaxy needs in these darkest of times. Today, 10,000 years after the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne, Saint Celestine continues her eternal mission. She appears wherever hope is needed most, wherever the faithful face trials that seem beyond their ability to overcome. Her golden light cuts through the darkness of a galaxy at war, proving that even in the grim future of the 41st millennium, miracles are still possible for those whose faith burns bright enough to kindle them. The Emperor protects, the faithful say when they speak of her. And through Saint Celestine, that protection takes forms that transcend mortal understanding, operating on scales that encompass not just individual lives, but the fate of entire civilizations. She is the living proof that in the Imperium of man, faith is not just a comfort for the weak, but a weapon wielded by the strong, a force capable of reshaping reality itself when channeled through souls pure enough to serve as conduits for divine will. She is Saint Celestine, and her war is eternal, is